Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to MIT App Inventor. Today we're going to be going over some examples of how you can use APIs. So I just want to really briefly talk about how you can go through this process and the process that I go through to even get to the stage where we can use an API. So let's go ahead and I'm going to jump over to my web browser here. And I'm going to start off with this process in terms of finding the weather API. So I have a couple different APIs I can show you guys, but I'm going to start off with how I do this. So if I find a good API, it's going to have good documentation. So you notice it has documentation on all of these. Now if I were to click on API doc, it's going to take me to a new link. And I can, notice it says I can request information in JSON, XML, or HTML format. We want JSON for our code because it's going to make our life easier. Now, it gives a couple examples of API calls here. So if I were to click on this link, it's going to actually, this is what the API is actually going to be sending to me. So if I go and look at this, I can see it sends me all of this JSON code, which I would then have to parse out what I want, right? If I wanted the description of things, I can grab this description token and then grab the value associated with it. So again, each of these, this is the link that I went to, but each of these is going to have its own unique call that you're going to have, and that's going to be based off of the URL of the API. Now notice there's a couple other things we can look at here. If you want to, you can look up, instead of querying a city, you could look up an ID number for a city, or you could look up geographic coordinates, as you can see here. So there's multiple ways we can go about using APIs, and each API has its own little way that you can grab information, because each API is grabbing, well, unique information. So it has to have its own little syntax here. So sometimes you have to kind of look through examples and piece it together. So we'll go back and we'll go look at MIT App Inventor and actually look at how this actually works. So if you look, not this one, let's go to this one. So if you look here, this is me. So when I say go to the front user interface, all I'm doing here is I search for a city, I press get weather, and it's going to get me the high temperature. A very simple app. Notice I have the web components. Now this web component is actually, it can be found, I believe, in connectivity, and this is actually what you're going to use to be able to grab information from an API. So then when we go in here, we can see that when I click on get weather, I'm going to do a couple things. First, I'm going to set the web1 URL to, first part is this, so I'm going to show you how this works, right? So if I click here, it's just going to, I can copy paste this in here. So let's just do this. Let's build this link, just like this is doing. Then it will do city name. Let's do London. And then it's going to take my key, which most APIs will require you to have a key. And all the key is it is something that you can use in order to identify, or the API uses to identify the user that is requesting the information. And that way it's not, there's not like bots on the internet just grabbing and taking up all their server space and all their API requests. So it's just a way to identify and limit the amount of times you can request information. You don't want to be doing this every microsecond, because then that API is going to be spending all of its time dealing with you rather than all of the other people that it might, actually want to deal with. So if we press enter on this link, it's not going to change anything because I already did this. Now this is what is actually located at this link. And this is the API. The API actually sent this to me. So I typed this into my URL, and it's going to actually, the API will respond with this information. So this is all of our information here. It has the coordinates, it has the weather, it has the temperature, the humidity, and the pressure. Now all I want, though, in this case, is I want the maximum temperature. Now, that's in the middle of all of this other hoopla. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to parse out that text. So if we scroll down here, now one thing I want to briefly mention out is we have to say call web1.get, because that is that HTTP method we talked about. It's the get method, right? We're actually getting this information. We're receiving it. Now after we get this text, we're going to call this block here, which says if we get a good response, which means response code equals 200, it means it was responded the way we want it to. We're going to set the high value text to parse the results and do some magic here. Now, this parse result block is the most important block that you guys will use in APIs. And it may change, but most of the time you can use this similar API block to what we created in class, and also what I'll be going over today. So let's take a look at that. Now here is this parse result block. It takes in 3 inputs, which is the JSON response, which is this. It takes in the start tag, which in this case, where our start tag is this right here, temp max with the quotes included and the colon. and then it takes in our end tag. And our end tag in this case, end tag is this right here. So it's this curly bracket followed by a comma. So now that's going to allow us to just grab this information right here. Just grab this value because that's all we want. So that's exactly what this block is doing. First, what we're doing is we're setting the global temp data, right? That's just a temporary data variable that I have, and we're splitting it we're splitting the JSON response at the start tag. So we're splitting everything from here on. Now we have everything there. After that, it asks if there are two things in this list because you should have separated this, and you should have two items in this list. Now, what we're going to be doing, it's kind of weird, it's just the way that the syntax works out with the way that JSON is, right? We have like arrays and we have different items in the list, but it should be separated into two things. Now, after that, we set the temporary data to the second item in the list. And the reason we're doing that is we just want to just get everything after this. And then what we're doing is we're splitting all of this, at the end tag. So we're splitting off everything after this. So everything after this is getting split off, which then leaves us with just the number we want, which is going to be stored in this temporary data, which we then decode from JSON into HTML, then from HTML into, normal data, not HTML. Then, after that, we are going to save that data in the temporary data, which is actually the result of this procedure, right? It parses out what we want. So let's take a look at that in action. Now, as you can see, when I call the parse result procedure, my start tag again was temp max, in quotes, with a colon after it. When we go back and look at that, that is exactly what we saw in the JSON code. Then if I look at the end tag, it's just the curly bracket and the comma, which is just after this. Now, it's pretty simple. Now, I just call that information, and then all this is doing is it's subtracting 273.15, because this is actually in Kelvin here, and obviously it's not 281 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit. We're not, living on Venus or anything crazy like that. So that's all that's doing, and then we're actually setting our result here into the high value text label that I have so that it will be able to be displayed on our user interface. Now, we could change what we're actually looking for, right? So say I wanted, for example, the description. So now the way I would do it is I would just copy paste this, and I would just take this, that's my new start tag, and then I would go back here, and then what's after my clear sky? So this is what I want, right? I want clear sky, but after that it's just a comma. So I'll take that and put that in here, right? Now, it's going to grab everything in between description and the comma that is after it, which should give me what I want. Obviously, I'd want to delete this whole mathematical minus 273.15 because that's not going to make sense, subtracting clear skies from 273.5. But that's that idea that we are using here. Now, if we go on, let's look at another example here, and I want to just show you like maybe a recipe API that I was looking at as well. Now, if we go to the recipe API, we can see that, again, there's some documentation here. It's a lot scarcer than the open weather API, but it's decent enough for me to get started. So you can notice I can search for things, I can get a recipe request, and I always need an API key. And it's going over how I can search for things and looking up getting recipes. So what I want to show you guys is an example of getting a recipe. So the way that this one works is instead of like looking up a term, you actually have to have a recipe number ID. So this is my ID number for, it looks like this is for, I don't know actually what this is for. Where's the name? Sweet banana bread. Okay, so 4502 45042 is the ID number of sweet banana bread. Now, if I typed in something else, well, maybe let's do 45000. See what that is. Now, this time it is milk and almond toffee. So each of these recipes, you'd have to go to this actual website, and if we actually go to the recipe sections of their website, you can actually, click on one. Maybe we'll want to make jalapeno popper grilled cheese, and you see that there's a number associated with it, which is that ID of the recipe that we have here. Now notice the difference again here is we said Q equals London in the middle. We said weather Q equals London. Well, here we say get ? Then we actually have our API key. And then we're actually going to be asking for what we want, and that's that and RID equals 4500. So it's a little bit different order, but it's clearly stated in the API lesson that if you look in here, it clearly shows you an example of how that actually works. So you kind of have to be careful about the order. Now, if we go back here, all we have to really change in this instance is we're setting web1 URL to join, and remember it's the first, this one's a little bit different. Continue, please. Thank you. This one's a little bit different. So you start with your API and you say your method, which is our get method, where we're getting information from the API. Then we have our API key, and you notice that we have the request of what information we want. Here's the recipe ID. That's what RID stands for. And then the recipe ID text would have to be actually the ID number. Now, obviously, people aren't going to know their ID text, so you probably have to code this in some way so that if they click a button, it'll automatically grab information for them. Now, if we go back and look at this API, we notice that it has a couple new things in here. It has ingredients. Now, this ingredients is an object that is has an array inside of it, right? So if we see these little square brackets, remember that's an array. So all of this going down to, where is it? All the way down to here is the actual ingredients. So if we wanted to parse out just the ingredients, this would be our opening tag, and then this would be our closing tag, or actually like this. So that would actually separate it. So if we go look down here, where is it? Right here, you can see we have description. No, this is the wrong one. Here we go. We can see you have ingredients, then /n, which is showing a new line, and that seemed to work for me. It might be a little bit different depending on what ingredient it is. Let's go back to 45042, right? So it should be relatively consistent, and again, we see that this is just like that. So remember, the main thing you have to do when you're looking at this JSON code is play around with your start tags and your ending tags, because if you have this parse result built properly, it should be able to parse the result. Those are kind of some examples there. Another cool example I was looking at was there's some cool NASA APIs that you can look at. One is like grabbing the astronomy picture of the day, which if you just go to APOD here, it says api.nasa.gov/planetary/APOD ? And then I gave it my API key. You can then see that it gives us a bunch of information and actually gives us a link to a URL, which we could actually use to grab an image. So this is maybe something that, I don't know, if you are interested, you could do. There's lots of cool APIs that you can explore. I can actually type this in and it should load this image. So again, you can, with APIs, there are ways that you can grab files like image files and things like that to display. I just took this right off the JSON code, and you can do that with most APIs if they have an image file. So again, the main thing to remember is we have to generate the proper URL with our API, which will take us to places like this. Then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to parse out the information we want based off of our start tag, which if we wanted this image, it would be this here, HD URL in quotes and a colon. And then we want to grab this value, which we could set as our maybe our image. So our end tag would in this case be the comma, and then we would be left with everything inside of here based off of this procedure, this parse result procedure. And then we can set that and use that variable wherever we want, that result inside of our code wherever we want. Now that's the basic idea of using APIs and some examples. It's kind of weird. Each API is a little bit, in terms of like the URL, like remember that if I did weather, I have to include the weather question mark query. And then over here, it was a little bit different. It was like the gets and the key and then the recipe ID. So each one is relatively, it's a little bit different. But once you get to this point where you get the JSON code, it's all about the same. You have that parse results, and it's going to make your life way easier. So I hope this was helpful. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to talk to me in person, send me an email, do whatever you need to do to get this to work. I'm happy to help you find APIs and figure out how this works. Well, not find APIs, but if you find an API that you want to make work, I'll help you with it and see what we can get to happen. All right? Well, happy programming.